Tonight we have another really interesting topic. We're going to talk about lessons from the Libya disaster, which is a wonderful case study of a number of facets of American foreign policy, certainly, ranging from immediate actions to long-term implications. Political scientists work so very hard at developing theories of international politics and principles that work, and very seldom do cases become so vivid that they can begin to articulate them. So I know we all look forward very much to our guest's presentation of the lessons of the Libya disaster. Professor Kuperman is a graduate of Harvard, A.B. in the physical sciences. A while later, he got his Master of Arts degree from Johns Hopkins in Washington, School of Advanced International Studies in International Relations and International Economics. He then later received his PhD from MIT. So it's a very interesting cluster of schools, and they certainly, I know, inform him. He brings also something a little unique to academia, and that is having been in government for a period of time. When he first left Harvard, he worked for a nuclear evaluation kind of organization, and that remained a big part of his intellectual life afterwards. He heads up now a nuclear proliferation prevention project at Texas, where he presently teaches. So that's an important and very interesting part of his intellectual life. But tonight, of course, we're dealing with the question of intervention. But I should mention, though, that of the people that he's worked for, including the young Congressman Charles Schumer, who now occupies a different position. So there's a wealth of knowledge which you gained. He also worked for the Speaker of the House for a period of time during that part of his life. But he's now at the University of Texas in their School of Policy Studies. I think it's the LBJ School, where he's an associate professor. The topic that we're dealing with tonight, primarily intervention, is one that he's looked at for years. And he wrote a book while he was still hadn't gotten his PhD yet on intervention, the limits of humanitarian intervention, genocide in Rwanda. And he came back to that theory again with an edited book years later, Limits on Humanitarian Intervention. Gambling, you're right, gambling. First one is limits, the second one is gambling. It's gotten less predictable as time has gone on. And there's one other, he also has edited a book on institutions and the prevention of conflict in a society, which has been recently published. And I think that's an absolutely fascinating theme. It's not our topic tonight, but it's a wonderful topic. But our topic tonight is indeed the questions of Libya and the lessons we might learn from it. It's a great pleasure to present Professor Alan Kuperman.
I'll have you know Frank gave that extremely generous and kind introduction with no notes, so that he's memorized my CV, and the only other person who's done that is my mom. So, very impressive. Well, thank you. Also impressive is to have such a wonderful turnout tonight. This is my first time at the Baltimore Council, and I can see it's a very vibrant community, and I hope I make it worth your while. So, as Frank said in his introduction, tonight we're going to talk about learning from the Libya disaster, and I'm going to try to make 4 points. First of all, why do I label the 2011 U.S.-led military intervention in Libya a quote-unquote disaster, and a disaster both for Libya and for the United States? Secondly, why did President Obama do something that was so counterproductive? Third, what would have happened if we had not intervened militarily in Libya? And then fourth, based on what comes before, I will look at lessons for the future. Okay, so first of all, number one, in what way is this a disaster? Well, for Libya, we can look at least 6 ways in which this was a disaster. First of all, war. There was already fighting in Libya prior to our intervention, but it was a very brief fight that was coming to a close. Rebels had taken up arms and challenged the government. In mid-February 2011, the government was surprised. When the rebels attacked, the government basically first tried to contain the uprising and then retreated. And the rebels went on the offensive towards the capital for about 2 weeks. At that point, the government got its act together, mobilized its military, which was much bigger, much better equipped than the rebels, and pushed the rebels back to where they had started in another 2 weeks. So that after a month, the rebels were back where they had started and were about to be defeated, and the war was going to end in about 1 month, perhaps 6 weeks. It would have been over. What happened as the result of our intervention? Well, the war against Qaddafi went on for not 1 month, but for 8 months. And then, after he was overthrown, Libya lapsed back into civil war, where it remains today, nearly 6 years later. So intervention turned a 1-month war into a 6 years plus war. Another way in which this war was a disaster for Libya is in terms of deaths. That 1-month war, which I mentioned, killed about 1,000 Libyans. That includes government soldiers, rebels, and some civilians caught in between. As the result of our intervention, the death toll has climbed to at least 15,000 and counting. About 10,000 during the war when we intervened to overthrow Qaddafi, and at least another 5,000 since then in the continuing civil war. So that's multiplying the death toll 15 times as the result of our intervention. In addition, life in Libya, order, has been destroyed. Now, life under Qaddafi was neither liberal nor democratic, but there really was a degree of order. I visited Libya once under Qaddafi's rule, and like a stupid young professor, I just wandered around. I wandered through slums, I wandered through neighborhoods, and I felt completely safe. Today, you can be, I don't want to parrot Trump, but you can be walking down the street and they can just shoot you. And things like that really do happen today in Libya. They didn't happen prior to our intervention. And even if one looks at the 1 month of fighting prior to our intervention, the force that the government used was quite discriminate, quite targeted. It was focused at the rebels. It was focused at the militants. And the way we know that is because of data that was gathered by well-respected international organizations such as Human Rights Watch. So the Human Rights Watch counted the casualties in the city that had the most fighting in that first month. That was a city called Misrata. And it found that of the casualties, women and children comprised 3% of the casualties. And this shows you that this was not the government just bombing neighborhoods or something like that, but trying to find the militants who overwhelmingly were males. By contrast, after our interventions and after our intervention and after militias took over Libya, I'll give you another statistic that was cited in 2014 in an incident of violence in Tripoli, the capital, committed by the militias. 49% of the casualties were women and children. So we've gone from an orderly society in which when there's fighting, it is focused on militants, to an anarchic society in which when there is violence, it is indiscriminate. Another way that this intervention was a disaster for Libya is in terms of radical Islam. There have always been some radical Islamists in Libya, but they were contained by Qaddafi. They were the enemies of Qaddafi, and so he contained them. And he contained them to a very, very small part of eastern Libya, and for the most part, they were scared to live under his rule, and so they left the country. They would have gone to places like Afghanistan, where they could join militant groups. But Libya was not a base, was not a haven, was not a place where radical Islam flourished. Now compare that to the situation after we intervened. Today, Islamist militias control all three of the biggest cities in Libya. That is the capital, Tripoli, the second city, Benghazi, and the third biggest city, Misrata. Also, another way that this intervention was a disaster for Libya, and maybe the way that Libyans feel it the most, is in terms of their economy. Prior to the intervention, Libya had the #1 standard of living in all of Africa. This is a UN Development Index statistic. The #1 out of the 53 or so countries in Africa, the standard of living was highest in Libya. Why? Because they had enormous oil exports and a small population. And Qaddafi distributed a good share of that revenue to the people in terms of infrastructure, healthcare, education, things like that. What about today? Well, today they're not exporting nearly as much oil. Their oil exports have dropped by approximately 2/3. Plus, there's fighting and the infrastructure has been destroyed. And so as a result, today, in this country that had the best standard of living in all of Africa, today when you go to the capital, according to press reports, there are blackouts for up to 18 hours a day. So you've gone from best standard of living to no electricity. And the last metric that I'll use for the effect of the intervention in Libya is human rights violations. Now, Qaddafi, the former ruler of Libya, was no pussycat. But his human rights performance had improved markedly over the decades to the point where groups like Human Rights Watch were no longer citing him for widespread human rights violations. What happened when we intervened? Well, when we intervened, these Islamists and other militias took over, and they have been incredibly brutal. They conducted ethnic cleansing against blacks living in Libya on the grounds that they were supposedly mercenaries. Women and children, mercenaries? Very hard to believe. They were all ethnically cleansed. Human Rights Watch says that after our intervention, the militias are guilty of crimes against humanity. That's not a term they throw around very loosely. Amnesty International, in case you don't trust Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International says the militants are guilty of quote-unquote war crimes. These are the folks we put into power. and again, Qaddafi was not accused of these things in the decade prior to being overthrown. Okay, so that's why this has been a disaster for Libya. Why is it a disaster for us? Didn't we get rid of this bad guy, Qaddafi? You recall how happy Hillary Clinton was when she got the news. You may have seen the video. For a number of reasons, this has been a disaster for us too. First, the global war on terror. Muammar Gaddafi was an ally of the U.S. in the global war on terror. He and his intelligence agency provided information to the U.S. for over a decade, even from before 9/11. The reason is radical Islam was his enemy. Radical Islamists were trying to overthrow him. So he saw common cause with the United States and was a great ally. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of the U.S. commander of AFRICOM, General William Ward, who in 2009, this is just 2 years before we decided to knock over Qaddafi, in 2009, General Ward said that Libya was, quote, a top partner in combating transnational terrorism, unquote. That was before we intervened. After we intervened, how does Libya figure into the war on terror? Well, they're part of the terror, not the war on terror. Al-Qaeda has expanded in Libya. ISIS, which had never set foot, didn't exist, now has a hub in Libya. Radical Islamists killed our ambassador, not before we intervened, after we intervened and overthrew Qaddafi. Terrorists in Libya are killing Christians and foreigners in Libya, massacring them, and videotaping it so we know. And radical Islamists in Libya are going cross-border and launching attacks in Tunisia, which is one of perhaps the only great success of the Arab Spring. So that's one way. Second way in which this was a disaster for the U.S. is that when we overthrew Qaddafi, some of his troops went into neighboring Mali, where they were originally from, and said, well, if we can't be part of the government in Libya, we'll overthrow the government in Mali. And so they took over the north of Mali, but then Al-Qaeda saw this instability and said, this is a great target for us. And so Al-Qaeda came in and usurped the leadership of that revolution in neighboring Mali and took over the northern half of this vast, vast country, and then started aiding Islamic militants in neighboring countries such as Nigeria, this group Boko Haram. Again, don't take my word for it. After we overthrew Qaddafi, and this led to instability in Mali, and al-Qaeda took over, U.S. Senator Chris Coons, who was chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Africa, said that Mali was, quote, now the largest territory controlled by Islamic extremists in the world, unquote. Direct result of our intervention in Libya. Another way it was disastrous for us. So a third way that it was disastrous for us was proliferation of very dangerous conventional weapons. Qaddafi had a huge arsenal of things like shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles to bring down aircraft. He wasn't shooting them at us. He wasn't shooting them at our aircraft. They were in his arsenal. But when we overthrew his regime, those weapons scattered. And they have been reported found in the Gaza Strip, in Egypt, and in both of those cases, the weapons were fired. They're not just reported to be there, but they were actually fired at aircraft. In Syria, in Somalia, in Algeria, and in Niger, in Africa. All places where Qaddafi's dangerous arsenal has now been scattered. And we can look forward to aircraft falling out of the sky for for years to come until perhaps the batteries on these things run out. A fourth way, and this is, as Frank said in his introduction, some of these effects are immediate, short-term, easy to see. Some of them are longer term, but no less dangerous, and in some ways more dangerous. And so this is an example of one. You may remember that at one time, Qaddafi had a weapons of mass destruction program. He had a chemical program, and even more dangerously, he had a nuclear weapons program. He had purchased centrifuges from an official in Pakistan, and these centrifuges could be used for the enrichment of uranium to nuclear to weapons grade to make a nuclear weapon. In 2003, Qaddafi decided to come clean, turn his entire nuclear weapons program over to the United States. In fact, it was literally exported to the United States. Some of it's down in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And he did this in return. It was a bargain. I'll turn over my weapons of mass destruction program, and we'll have a rapprochement. And I won't be your enemy, and you won't be my enemy. This was a great, great victory for nuclear nonproliferation until we broke the deal and bombed him and facilitated a rebellion to overthrow, torture, and then kill him. Now, what sort of message does this send to any other country that has a nuclear weapons program? Should it abandon the nuclear weapons program? Or should it proceed, maybe even accelerate the nuclear weapons program so that it has a deterrent against the U.S.? Which is the best way to secure yourself? To come clean and make friends with the U.S., or to build a nuclear weapons arsenal? This clearly sends a message that you should, if you have any doubts, if you're in another country, you should go ahead with a nuclear arsenal, not give up your nuclear weapons arsenal. It's really a disaster for nuclear nonproliferation. And once again, don't take my word for it. Take North Korea's word for it. They said that based on this Libyan precedent, North Korea will not fall for the same U.S. quote-unquote tactic to disarm the country, unquote. So they view that the U.S., if you're a patsy if you give up your nuclear weapons program to the U.S., because the U.S. will say, thank you, we're your friend, and then a few years later, they'll overthrow you. And not only did North Korea say this, but the Iranian supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, said almost the exact same thing. This is, you kind of love the rhetoric, actually. He said that first we persuaded Qaddafi to turn over the nuclear program, and then, quote unquote, this is the Iranian supreme leader, he said, quote unquote, Western leaders dropped him like a brick, unquote. That's exactly what we did. That's exactly what we did. Okay, and then the last way in which, there are probably others, but the last one I'll talk about in which this intervention was a disaster for the United States is the effect that it had on Syria. If you can remember back far enough to February, March of 2011, the uprising in Syria was peaceful. The response to it by the Syrian regime was not peaceful, but it was circumscribed. There were on the order of, if I recall properly, something around 100 Syrians dying per week, 100 Syrians dying per week, because it was a peaceful uprising with a violent but circumscribed response from Assad. Once we intervened in Libya on behalf of violent rebels, it's a bit redundant, on behalf of rebels as opposed to peaceful protesters, then the people in Syria looked at this and said, wait a minute, you're not intervening to help us in Syria because we're peaceful, but you are intervening to help rebels in Libya, so maybe what we need to do in Syria is switch from nonviolent rebellion to violent rebellion. And then the U.S. and NATO will come and help us the same way they helped the rebels in Libya. There are quotes to this effect from Syrian revolutionaries saying, we want to get the same kind of no-fly zone in Syria that the U.S. had just imposed on Libya to help the rebels overthrow Qaddafi. Once the Syrian rebels switched from nonviolence to violence, however, Assad massively escalated his response. And so rather than on the order of dozens or 100 dying per week, we went to thousands dying per week. And so this is another one of these unexpected long-range consequences that is very negative for us. The war escalated in Syria, Iran intervened, Russia intervened, and we are now in the back seat in that part of the world. Okay, so that, you can disagree with me, but in my opinion, based on those metrics, that history, the intervention was a disaster for Libya and a disaster for the U.S. So why did President Obama do something so stupid? First of all, why do I blame this intervention on President Obama? I do because this intervention would not have happened without President Obama. There were a lot of people pushing for this intervention in Europe, especially the French and the British. They were not going to intervene without us, in part because they can't. Simply the way our forces are integrated in NATO, there are certain capabilities that we provide, aerial refueling, intelligence, reconnaissance, that they can't do. And so you can have a fighter aircraft, but if it can't be refueled, if it doesn't know where the target is, it's not really very useful for much. And so this intervention was not going to happen without the U.S. And so President Obama is responsible for this intervention. Why did he do something that we can say in retrospect seems so stupid? Some people were saying it was going to be stupid even before. Well, I think there are at least three reasons. First, he was the victim of propaganda. The rebels in Libya were making two false claims. First of all, they were claiming that their uprising was peaceful. It was not. It was violent from the first days in the east of Libya and in the west of Libya. Second, they were claiming that Qaddafi was responding in a genocidal way. He was not. As the statistics I already mentioned make clear, he was targeting militants, not civilians. But this propaganda propagated, was widely reported by respectable media. It started in less well-known media. It started in things like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, but it was picked up by CNN and New York Times and so forth. And people in Obama's administration who felt very strongly about humanitarian issues and interventions, people like Samantha Power, who was eventually the UN ambassador, but was in the White House at the time on humanitarian affairs, Susan Rice. They pushed Hillary Clinton to support this intervention on grounds that this was a peaceful uprising that was being responded to with genocide. And so they convinced Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, and then Hillary Clinton apparently convinced President Obama. This was opposed by people at the Pentagon and the CIA. Well, the CIA doesn't take policy positions, but they warned of the dangers of it. And the people and the Secretary of Defense opposed this. But President Obama made the decision. Okay. Second reason that President Obama did this ill-advised thing is a second type of propaganda that he fell victim to. And that is that the Libyan people were united against Qaddafi. The idea here is that everybody knows Qaddafi is a crazy, violent dictator, and everybody knows that people everywhere are yearning to breathe free and always want to overthrow a tyrant. And so if we simply intervened, that all of the Libyan people would unite in support of our intervention. And therefore, our intervention would be relatively easy. If President Obama had thought this was going to be a hard intervention, I don't think he would have done it. But he thought, here's a case where I can do something fairly cheap, quick, and easy for a good cause. Of course, the Libyan people were not united against Qaddafi. He had large segments of the population in support of him. It would be hard to put a number on it, but I would say it would be close to about half of the population supported him. And so by intervening, it wasn't going to be something where all the people were against Qaddafi. You were going to pit half of the Libyan people against the other half of the Libyan people. This is not the first time we've made this mistake, as I'm sure you know. Think back just to Iraq, which was only 8 years before. If you recall, the rhetoric was it was going to be a cakewalk because we were going to be welcomed with open arms. Well, it's 13 years later, and we're still not welcomed with open arms in Iraq. We make this mistake a lot. We think if there's some leader we don't like, everyone in the country must hate him. But you know what? The reason that leader is still there is because not everyone in the country hates him. He would have been overthrown long ago if everyone hated him. Large swaths supported Saddam. Large swaths supported Qaddafi. Intervention in each case wasn't a cakewalk. We weren't welcomed with open arms in either case. Each case, we just triggered a horrible civil war. The last reason that I got to speed up, by the way, Frank. I'm going to be one of those long talkers. The last reason that President Obama made this mistake, I think, is that the American government, media, and public had an image of Qaddafi, and it's an image from the old days, an image of when he really was a very, very bad guy and an enemy of the United States, when he is alleged to have shot a plane out of the air at Lockerbie, when he attacked U.S. servicemen in Berlin at a discotheque, when he armed rebels all over Africa and the rest of the world to start civil wars. And so we saw him, and even if you look at the reports in early 2011, they talk about Qaddafi, the mad dog, this language from the 80s. It's not the 80s. It's 30 years later. People change. People change. Donald Trump used to be a Democrat. People change. All right? And it wasn't 30 years ago. So people change. We accept it with certain people, but we couldn't accept it with Qaddafi. We had this idea that even though for 10 years he'd been turning over terrorists to us, torturing terrorists for us if we wanted, he was still a bad guy. He was still our enemy. And so this chance to get rid of him seemed just what a great opportunity, because we know he's a bad guy. But he was no longer a bad guy. But it's very hard for people to change their impressions of someone, especially when they're so stark. Okay. So the third thing I'm going to talk about is what would have happened if we had not intervened. Well, first of all, there would not have been a bloodbath. We're told there would have been a bloodbath. President Obama explained in a speech to the country, this is why we intervened, because there was going to be a bloodbath. Let me tell you, folks, there was not going to be a bloodbath. The rebels had been chased out of every single city in Libya. There had been a bloodbath in 0 of those cities. They were now in one last city. They were about to be chased out of that city. It was going to take a few days. They were not going to stand and fight. They hadn't stood and fought in any city. What were they going to do? They were going to put their cars in reverse and go this way to Egypt. And in fact, Qaddafi was urging them to do that. There was not going to be a fight. There was not going to be a bloodbath. And not only that, but there's a claim that Qaddafi threatened a bloodbath. He didn't threaten a bloodbath. I urge you to go back and read his speech. He said, I will not attack civilians. I will not attack rebels who surrender and throw away their arms. I will not attack rebels who flee to Egypt. The only people I will attack are rebels who stand and fight me. No threat of bloodbath, no history of bloodbath. There was not going to be a bloodbath. Well, what would have happened to poor Libya if we'd left this dictator in place? Well, he was a relatively old person, not in very good health. If you took a look at him, you knew he was not in very good health. He was not going to live much longer. Well, what was going to happen to Libya then? Well, it was the transition was fairly, the succession was fairly well forecast, and that was going to be his son. And he had a bunch of sons, but it was going to be the most moderate, the most liberal, the one who had a PhD from the London School of Economics, Saif al-Islam al-Qaddafi. And now, Frank and I talked about Thomas Jefferson today before my talk. Saif was not Thomas Jefferson, but he was clearly a reformist. And he said, for example, that he would not succeed his father unless there were a new constitution with guaranteed liberal rights and a truly democratic election. And he took a lot of heat within Libya for this, but that was his position. And so that was the person that was the future of Libya if we had not intervened. Okay? And if we weren't sure about that, we could have ensured that he was going to be the future of Libya. So at the beginning of this intervention, Libya said, please, please, please negotiate with us. Please negotiate a peaceful resolution of this. And in those negotiations, the discussion was that Qaddafi himself would become a figurehead like the Queen of England, and his son Saif would actually take over. So we could have ensured that this liberal reformer took over Libya. Instead, we intervened. Where's Saif now? He's sitting in jail in Western Libya. Okay, so now to what was supposed to be the topic today. What are the lessons of this disaster? Well, in political science and international relations theory, you have a thing called realists, and I'm going to guess that Frank might put himself in that basket. I don't know. Just met Frank today. But based on some of our discussions, I'm guessing that a bunch of you might put yourself in that basket. And realists often say we shouldn't intervene anywhere on humanitarian grounds. And they would cite this Libya case. In fact, I have a colleague at the University of Texas. He says, you got the case exactly right, but you drew the wrong lesson. The lesson is we shouldn't intervene anywhere. And the reason I don't draw that lesson is that sometimes interventions help a lot. They help them, and they help us. A nice example is another case I've documented in Liberia, where in 2003, with a very light intervention, we got rid of a terrible guy, Charles Taylor, who was bad for the U.S. and bad for his own people, and we got a democracy there that 13 years later is still going. And that followed 13 years of civil war before we did this intervention. So intervention can work. And when you don't intervene, or even when you delay intervention, sometimes you make things worse. So the lesson is not simply don't intervene anywhere on humanitarian grounds. Now, what lesson has the Obama administration drawn? Well, they've drawn several, but the one that annoys me the most is the one I'll cite. And you've heard this from many officials in the Obama administration. They say, well, the lesson is nothing works. And they'll say, look at Iraq. In Iraq, we did big intervention, we occupied the country with ground troops, and it's a disaster. In Libya, we just bombed, but we didn't put ground troops, and it's a disaster. And in Syria, we did neither, and it's a disaster. So therefore, nothing works. We had an official from the Obama administration, Colin Kahl, who came down, and he said, so nothing works. Riddle me that, Batman. That's what he said. It'll stick in my mind forever. Riddle me that, Batman. And so I could go into a complicated explanation of why that's wrong, but I'll give you an analogy. Let's say I gave you chicken watermelon and ice cream. Okay? And what you did is you ate the chicken raw, and you got violently ill. And with the watermelon, you fried it, and it was disgusting. And with the ice cream, you boiled it, and it melted away to nothing. And you know what you'd say? There is no way to prepare food that's edible. Riddle me that, Batman. Okay? Right? It could be you did the wrong thing in each case. Not that there was nothing that could be done, but you did the wrong thing in each case. All righty. So I don't think that Obama officials' lesson is the right lesson either. I have 4 lessons, which I'll close with, for lessons from Libya for intervening better in the future. The first is, and it should be clear from what I talked about tonight, beware propaganda. Rebels have an interest in convincing us that they are more unified and popular than they are, and that the regime is more evil and genocidal than it is. Second, we should care about humanitarian violations, but we should not let them overshadow the U.S. national interest, so that it's in my opinion good to intervene on humanitarian grounds, so long as you don't, by doing so, undermine nuclear nonproliferation or the war on terror. If you have to choose, you should pick your own national interest over somebody else's humanitarian concern. A lot of times we don't have to choose, but if we do have to choose, we need to remember to prioritize our own national interest. Third of the 4 lessons is what I call the moral hazard of humanitarian intervention. And I've written articles and edited books on this question. But in this, to boil it down, if a state is involved in a domestic conflict, and it is against a rebellion, and it is targeting militants, not civilians, okay, as in Libya, then we should not intervene on humanitarian grounds. Because if we intervene in a situation like that, it is actually going to embolden the rebels to escalate their rebellion, and that is going to embolden the government to escalate its counter-rebellion. And that means a lot more people are going to get killed, including civilians. And if your goal in intervening was to protect civilians, then why would you intervene in a way that's going to actually get more civilians killed? It makes no sense. So in a situation where the government is fighting rebels and actually targeting the rebels, don't intervene on humanitarian grounds, because it will be counterproductive. And the last lesson, which I think you'll see how it comes clearly out of the case, is that if we have enemies around the world and they acquiesce to our demands, then we need to reward them, not punish them. Because if they acquiesce and then we punish them, then we removed the incentive for anybody else to ever acquiesce to our demands. And this, as Frank will know, is straight political science. Thomas Schelling wrote this in 1966. He said, if you're going to coerce someone, you also have to reassure them that if they do what you want, you will hold them harmless. And in this case, we double-crossed Qaddafi. Why should anyone ever trust us ever again? It is really a disastrous long-term effect on U.S. foreign policy. Anyway, thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
After telling people, repeat the question to the camera.
Okay. Ma'am? So the question was, the questioner is saying that it's reported that President Obama didn't listen to military or intelligence briefings, and that might explain why he fell for propaganda or the urgings of other officials in his administration. I had not heard that President Obama was turning down intelligence briefings. I've heard recently that somebody else has been turning down intelligence briefings, but I had not heard that. It's possible. All I know is that the Secretary of Defense at the time was Gates, Robert Gates, said publicly prior to the intervention, and this is when we were already involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, he said, "I'm not sure we need a third war against a Muslim country." And he said that publicly, so even if President Obama wasn't getting briefings privately, I do think he reads the newspaper. And so I think he knew that the Secretary of Defense was against this. If I had to guess how he was thinking, President Obama is generally against intervention. He saw his role as getting us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, reversing to interventions. The last thing in the world he wanted to do was have another long U.S. commitment. On the other hand, he had always considered himself a humanitarian, and he had, Samantha Power, whom is maybe not a household name, but in my field she is, because she wrote a book about how the U.S. had failed to intervene in many genocides around the world, and it was due to a lack of political will, moral cowardice. And Senator Obama hired her to be his staffer. So he, as a senator, saw himself as a great humanitarian who would never let a genocide happen under his watch. So he had these competing instincts. On the one hand, I don't want to be an intervener. On the other hand, I don't want to allow genocide. And so I think he saw Libya as this great, fantastic, we finally have a case where I can do a quick intervention. So I don't have to worry about another long intervention, and I can stop genocide. And the question is why he thought it would be a quick intervention. And I think historians will puzzle over for a long time, since he's the one who had pointed out that our last two interventions had led to quagmires. And I think it's a little bit of what psychologists or political psychologists call motivated bias. He wanted it to be true that this could be a quick and easy intervention that saved a lot of lives and overthrew a dictator and put in place a Democrat. What a great, win-win-win-win-win. And because he wanted it to be true, he thought it could be true. I would put it more on that than not having received briefings. But we'll see. Historians will tell us if he didn't receive briefings. I appreciate the question. The question was about Ambassador Christopher Stevens, who was killed on September 11th, 2012, about a year and a half after we started our intervention in Libya, and about the advice that he was giving the Obama administration. I would have to go back and check, but I don't think he was our ambassador at the time of the intervention. So I don't think he was providing information to President Obama, but perhaps he was. Does anyone know for sure? Did you want to speak on that? No? So, you know what? I'll make one comment on your question, and that is that Ambassador Stevens was supposed to, was well liked, was supposed to know the Libyan people, and it's this expression, the Libyan people, and I think that we fall for it. The Libyan people hated Qaddafi. The Libyan people were going to welcome us with open arms. The Libyan people yearned for democracy. There's a lot of different factions in Libya. The East and the West hate each other. Various tribes hate each other. Highly religious people hate the secular people. There's as in any country, there's a lot of animosity. There were a lot of people who really did like Ambassador Stevens, but there's obviously a bunch of people who got together to attack the facility where he was. So I appreciate the question. The main part of the question was that it's too soon to say that Libya is a disaster because perhaps these rebel groups through fighting or through negotiation, will consolidate and come to gain political control and even lead to democracy. I'll take the second one first and the first one second. The process you're talking about, where various warlords fight against each other, and then whoever can produce violence better than the other defeats the other and absorbs their force and their people, and then goes on to fight some other warlord that has defeated some, sort of like the Final Four bracket in the NCAA, where you start with 64 or even more now, and 32, 16, 8, and so forth, and eventually you get to the Final Four, and eventually you get to the finals, and one wins, and then that person declares themselves not the warlord, but the president, and then, or the king, and then over time, people get upset at the king and they demand rights, and then eventually they force democracy. That process in Western Europe took over 500 years.
But it's not one winning. The theory says nobody can win, and as a result, they start negotiating an institutionalized negotiation.
That is not Charles Tilly's theory, and Charles Tilly is for my money, Charles Tilly passed away about 5 years ago, but for me, he's the number one theorist along those lines. It certainly could happen quicker. I study civil wars and peace agreements and consociational democracy and power sharing and all sorts of things like that. It is possible it could happen in Libya in less than 500 years. But Libya, to me, looks a lot like Lebanon did in the 80s. And that war ended not because of a deal between warlords, but because a neighboring hegemon, Syria, came in and said, we're bigger than all of you folks. You're now just going to be a wholly owned subsidiary of Syria. And so I don't see anybody who's going to do that in Libya. And so you're right. It's... what's the old joke? What do you think of the French Revolution? Too soon to tell. So perhaps it's too soon to tell, but perhaps you'll at least agree with me that as of today, it's a disaster for them and for us. And it's like people, some in Iraq say the same thing. They say, hey, we got rid of Saddam, and we might still get a peaceful democracy. And we also might find the weapons of mass destruction. It's possible. But I don't have a lot of confidence that's going to happen anytime soon. So not to be flip, but whenever one measures something and assesses it, someone else can come along and say, it's too soon for that. And there's no counter-argument. You're right. You're right. It might work out. And then in retrospect, these people will have been geniuses, maybe. But then you have to run the counterfactual of, well, what would have happened had we not intervened? This questioner says that he had thought there really was going to be a genocide risk in Libya before we intervened, and that is why we intervened. And he thought so because everything he read and saw in the press said that. And so if that's wrong, he asks, where does one go to get the real information or better information? And it's a very good question. This was, I gave not this talk, but a related talk to a master's program in Washington, D.C. that's at a school for the intelligence community. So it was all these mid-level intelligence officers. You need a security clearance to enroll in the school. I'd never heard of this school. It's pretty cool. And they asked me that question because they were very concerned about this. And what I said is that one has to use, one has to do two things. One, understand a case well enough to try to figure out what the players want and what's in their interest, and so what they would rationally do. Okay, so that's the first thing. And the second thing is one has to be like a detective and think about, okay, if what is claimed is happening, what evidence should I find? So on the first method, one would look at this and say, okay, Qaddafi is accused of committing genocide. Well, historically, has he done that when he's challenged? And the answer is no. There's been lots of little rebellions in Libya over the years. He's never committed genocide before. Why would he do that now? That would be out of character. It would be rational. And in fact, he didn't even do it back when he was the bad Qaddafi. That wasn't our ally. Now that he's the good Qaddafi and doesn't want to annoy us, why would he do that? So that's the first thing that perhaps would make you skeptical when you read this. But then the second thing is, okay, if he's massacring people in Libya, then what evidence should we expect to find? And so that's the question I asked myself in February of 2011, before we intervened in March of 2011. And I said, well, there should be a lot of dead bodies, because usually with genocide, there's a lot of dead bodies. I said, okay, well, is it possible there's dead bodies, but we just haven't seen any images of them? And I said to myself, well, people have these things, even if they have these, okay, this is a flip phone, it still has a camera, okay? This is 1990s technology. And I'm only a little bit of a Luddite. And people in Libya have these things, so they can take pictures. Well, the question is then, could they get the pictures out? So I did this very classified investigation called Googling to check whether the internet was up or down in Libya, and it was up. So they have cameras and they have internet. Well, if there's dead bodies, then they're going to show up in front of me. CNN's going to have them, BBC's going to have them. There were no pictures of dead bodies. Ipso facto, there's no genocide. So where do you go? I would say right here, between the two ears. That's where you go. You have to, unfortunately, reporters should be doing this. Reporters should be doing this, but intelligence community, I take you a bet the intelligence community was saying that there have been no massacres. And in fact, there's a quote from an unnamed senior intelligence official who says that the decision to go into Libya, this is a great, you can't make this stuff up, it was an intelligence light decision. You can't make this up. It's why I don't watch those programs on TV like the West Wing and stuff, because reality is way more bizarre.
Well, it couldn't have been more lucid or informative. Marvelous evening. Thank you so very much.